Well, I can see people are still bursting through the doors, but a good afternoon to everyone who's made it in already, and a very warm welcome to the CHIC webinar day and this discussion on asset management with its exhortation that now is the time for action. My name is Mark Easton. I'm delighted to be chairing this session for the next hour in the virtual company of three incredibly knowledgeable individuals. Lucy Hutton is Head of Social Housing Safety, Decency and Climate Change at the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, which is quite a long title and quite a skill set too. Actually, the first time I saw decency in your title, Lucy, I did wonder whether you put skirts on table legs and tutted at sleeveless vests. But of course, this is about homes fit for the future, decent homes, safe, secure and sustainable. So hello to Lucy. John Fisher is well known to you all, of course, as the Managing Director of CHIC and someone who wakes every morning wondering how he can help housing landlords work more efficiently. So good afternoon to John. And our third panelist is Rob Collier. He's a senior consultant at the ARC Consultancy, specifically working on supporting ARC's asset management projects. And he was previously actually head of assets at One Manchester, the stock transfer company, where he helped deliver major planned works, maintenance, oversaw the strategy and planning for that landlord. So spookily well qualified for a discussion on asset management. It's almost as though it's been planned. Welcome to you all, and welcome to all of those who've joined us on the call this afternoon. I can see we now have 42 people. That's a really good crowd. We're really keen that any questions people may have for our experts are put to them. So please do use the Q&A feature for your googlies and your knuckleballs, and I will endeavour to divert them neatly into our slip cordon of experts. If your question is specifically for one of the panel, please do say. And I should say that CHIC will be distributing all the presentational material that's being used today to the attendees after the event, including a video recording of the session so you can relive the best bits. And that'll all be available on the CHIC website. And of course, excitement already building ahead of the 10th annual CHIC conference. Bookings are now open for registration again on the CHIC website. That's taking place on Wednesday, the 17th of November. Today, of course, was when we were supposed to be having that event, but that fell victim to the blasted virus. So a webinar day instead. Now, a lot has been happening in the housing sector in the last year, despite all the restrictions. We now have draft legislation which will transform the planning laws. We also have the Building Safety Bill, and we've seen the introduction of the Fire Safety Act 2021 and the Social Housing Act 2021. So a lot of change, and change which asset managers must respond to and hopefully understand. Now, each of our panelists is going to present their thoughts on all of this, and then we'll have plenty of time, hopefully, for questions at the end. So first up, please welcome from MHCLG, Lucy Hutton. Lucy.
Thank you very much, Mark. Can I just check, can you see my presentation?
We can.
Excellent, that's a great start. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. My name is Lucy Hutton, and I'm a policy official at MHCLG. And as Mark said, I lead the Safe and Decent team within the Social Housing Division. And I'm absolutely delighted to be talking to you today about the Social Housing White Paper and the implications for social housing asset management. So I'm sure many of you will already be familiar with the Social Housing White Paper. The paper came about following the tragic events at Grenfell Tower in 2017. Government undertook a wide-ranging consultation engaging with over 7,000 people, and this resulted in the publication of the Social Housing Green Paper in August 2018, and then the Social Housing White Paper, which was published in November 2020. So this slide broadly summarises the content of the Social Housing White Paper. And of particular interest, I think, for those concerned with asset management is Chapter 1, to be safe in your home, Chapter 2, to know how your landlord is performing, and Chapter 6, to have a good quality home and neighbourhood to live in. And I'll talk about these areas in a bit more detail shortly. But this content should really be understood as part of a package of proposals that together aim to drive a real culture change throughout the social housing sector, creating proactive consumer regulation and rebalancing the relationship between landlords and tenants, particularly with respect to tenants being treated with respect. So Chapter 1, to be safe in your home. Building safety is a top priority for government. As Mark said, in July 2020, we published the Building Safety Bill. The bill will enhance the regulatory regime for high-risk buildings. However, the work within the social housing division, where I am based, applies to all social homes, regardless of risk. And the proposals here include to legislate to require a social landlord to identify a nominated person within their organisation who will be responsible and accountable for compliance with health and safety requirements. We will be consulting on, or rather we have consulted, on mandating smoke and carbon monoxide alarms in social housing, to bring greater parity with expectations that currently exist in the private rented sector, where alarms are already required. We plan to consult on ways to ensure residents are protected from harm caused by electrical safety. And again, this is in part driven by a desire for parity between the tenures. So in the private rented sector, 5-yearly electrical safety inspections are already required by law, whereas no such expectation exists in social housing. So finally, we want to create a culture where landlords engage effectively with their residents on safety issues, so that residents are both safe and feel safe within their home. So Chapter 2, to know how your landlord is performing. So the main aim here is to instill culture change by driving greater transparency into the system, to really try and address the imbalance of information between landlords and residents. So fundamentally, it aims to transform the consumer role of the regulator of social housing so that it proactively manages compliance with the consumer standards, particularly on issues concerned with asset management. So we're actively taking forward work to develop a set of tenant satisfaction measures, in other words, key performance indicators, that will likely include indicators on performance against decent homes, responsive repairs, building safety issues, including compliance with health and safety obligations, and tenant satisfaction with landlord repairs and safety. And skipping ahead, Chapter 6 is concerned with ensuring residents have a good quality home and neighbourhood to live in. So in the white paper, we announced a review of the Decent Home Standard that has begun, and I will talk about that in more detail shortly. Creating well-designed and well-managed social homes has been at the heart of the vision for social housing from the outset. And in our consultation events, people talk to us about their pride in their community, but how sometimes this was let down by poor neighbourhood management, upkeep of buildings and quality of shared spaces. And some of these issues have been magnified by COVID-19. Some residents have struggled to find green spaces to exercise, and others have experienced isolation, loneliness, and the challenge of dealing with antisocial behaviour. So on implementation progress, on safety and decency. We launched the Decent Homes Review in February this year. 18 stakeholders were invited to attend the Decent Home Standard Review sounding board. And these are primarily landlord and tenant representative organisations, but also include the Regulator of Social Housing and the Housing Ombudsman. We've also issued an open invitation to all other stakeholders to receive papers and submit evidence to the review. To date, we've had 122 organisations and 13 individuals register. The review itself will be conducted in 2 parts. So the first part is understanding the case for change to the criteria, and will conclude in autumn 2021. And whilst we anticipate that our main outcome will be a new Decent Home Standard, that's not certain currently. So we need to fully understand the weaknesses with the current standard before we progress on to part 2 of the review. So far, we've explored how to make the technical parts of the standard more understandable to residents. We have aimed to understand whether there are any unintended consequences from Decent Homes 1 that we would like to correct in a new standard. We've explored the lack of strategic fit between the current standard and new priorities for both government and residents and the sector, including net zero and building safety. And we've looked at how helpful and useful are the current definitions around, say, disrepair in terms of social landlord deliverability. So we're now moving on to consider what the standard might say to ensure social homes are fit for the 21st century. So this includes present day expectations on security and place, digital inclusion and lifetime homes. Our sounding board meeting in September will consider the pressing issue of thermal comfort in the context of climate change and net zero. On electrical safety, we've launched a new working group. This group is actively considering policy around mandating electrical safety checks and wider issues around communication with residents and access to homes to ensure electrical safety. For anyone wishing to get more closely involved in either the Decent Homes Review or the Electrical Safety Working Group Review, I will arrange for an email address to be circulated to participants, and do feel free to get in touch with the department and we can make sure you are able to get involved. So on smoke and carbon monoxide alarms, I'm sure many of you will have responded to the consultation that we published in November last year. We're currently reviewing responses to that consultation, which closed in January, and will publish a response in due course. Many of you will be aware that we also published the final report of the Social Sector Engagement Best Practice Group, Building Safety Best Practice Group, that identified practical ways to improve communication with residents on building safety in the social sector. So on implementation of the new regulatory regime, the Regulator of Social Housing has recently appointed a director who will start in the summer. And of course, amongst the range of other measures we're taking forward, we are in the process of drafting the social housing regulation bill that will take forward in full the new consumer regulation regime. Okay, so that's pretty much all I was intending to say. So I'll stop sharing my slides now and hand back to Mark. Thank you.
You're muted, Mark.
Schoolboy error there. Yes, thank you, Lucy. You came to an end and I wasn't ready for you, but thank you very much indeed for a really fascinating presentation. And I would say to everybody, actually, do go on the Q&A if there's any questions that you would like to put to Lucy based on what she's already said. Just go on there, put your questions down. We'll come to them, as I say, after we've heard from all three of our panelists. But it'd be good to get an idea, and while it's still fresh in your mind, I think that would be jolly useful. Well, now to prove that he is a technical wizard and Zoom aficionado, please welcome the second of our expert panelists, the MD of CHIC, of course. It's John Fisher. John.
Right. Thank you, Mark. Just to probably prove you wrong now, we will get the slideshow to work, and I believe you can now see that. So morning everyone, or afternoon rather. Thank you for joining us on this CHIC event, and Lucy, thanks ever so much for that very interesting presentation. I think what I'm going to be saying is very complimentary to particularly the consultative work that you're undertaking at the moment, and the proposals that are emerging, particularly from work on the white paper. So the question is, asset management now is the time for action, and I think it definitely is, and I'm going to try and explain why. On this slide, if you look at the Venn diagram, homes is very much at the centre of the Venn diagram, and the Venn diagram represents effectively a social housing business. And for a long time, quite rightly, we focus on customer service, but if we get the home and the place that the home is in right, and people are happy living there, a lot of the other expectations that Lucy talked about will certainly come through. And we've had a bit of a history in the sector of seeing the maintenance budget, as it's often called, because it's the biggest budget, is the easy one to raid to balance the books and to focus on development. And getting that balance right has to be a huge focus, continuing focus for the sector going forward. Making sure we invest in the right homes in the right places is critical. Lucy talked about decent homes. My view is there's nothing wrong with the decent home standard, but it doesn't go far enough. So improving the elements and updating elements of people's homes is really important, but it's the neighbourhoods and the feeling of community safety and so on that Lucy talked about in feedback from the consultation they've done. So for me, looking forward, and hopefully this is what will come out of the legislation, is that we'll have decent homes, but also that are in really great places, and the decarbonisation issue, which I'll come back to a little bit later, homes that are warm and affordable to heat. So in terms of taking a look at the sector and asset management, complex diagram on the left, but effectively it's the asset management planning process. And at the beginning of that, if we understand what we've got, what the standards need to be, what current performance is, use our data intelligently, again, a theme I'll come back to, then ultimately we'll be investing in the right homes to the right degree, and ultimately the right outcome for customers. The diagram on the right is a sort of typical benchmark figure for what we would be expecting at CHIC. Most landlords to be spending on most of their homes on average. So £2,300 per home per annum, maintaining them. I'm going to go through each bit of that Venn diagram in a tiny bit more detail, but it's a big chunk of rental income. You know, rental incomes from sort of £5,000 to £7,000 typically. That's a big proportion. Some will be slightly more, some slightly less. But if landlords are spending much less than that, there probably is an issue to be addressed. So the first part of that Venn diagram, responsive repairs and voids, revenue spend, absolutely key service. It's got to carry on. It delivers a decent repairs service to residents, and it employs people to deliver that service. And these are the staff that our customers see coming through their doors on a regular basis. So whatever we do, it's here to stay. So a decent repair service and a decent service turning around and reletting empty homes is absolutely critical. What this graph shows is that we tend to work on averages and KPIs in the sector, and the average number of repairs per home per annum is about 3, but the rather strange shaped graph shows that there are big outliers. There's a load of customers, normally 10–15%, who don't ask for any repairs, and those at the most extreme are asking for more than 1 a fortnight. Understanding our businesses understanding what the repairs demand is and managing that. There will be reasons for that. Could be housing management reasons, could be tenancy management reasons, could be asset management reasons, or a mixture of all. But understanding that using data intelligently is critical. And this slide, again, funny shape, but it shows the difference between repair cost in bungalows, flats, houses and maisonettes. And did you know that flats and maisonettes cost more in the average cost of repair than houses and bungalows? Although for a landlord, they're probably more dispersed. So again, understanding data, what it tells us, what we do with it in terms of future investment is important. And another set of facts you may or may not know, younger people are more demanding of a repair service than people of older generations, quite significantly so, to the tune of about 30 or 40%. And that same group of people actually tend to have higher rent arrears. So the demand related to demographics on the housing business can be quite significant depending upon what housing you provide, where you provide it, to whom you provide it. Again, data used intelligently. Next part of asset management, that's about repairs and voids. This is about building safety, a big issue that Lucy touched on. And we tend to focus on the big six, so gas safety, electrical inspection, again, new rules to follow, lifts and lifting equipment, water hygiene, asbestos and fire safety. Fire safety clearly has been a huge issue post-Grenfell. But there are about 45 other potential areas of risk where, to keep people safe, you need to manage that activity efficiently. And this, I'm pleased to say, has now become right at the top of people's agenda. So from an asset management point of view, the spend isn't huge, but the importance is exponentially greater than probably anything else. And to provide a great asset management service on building safety, you need to obviously know what the asset base is, know what the rules are. That's not only the law, it's best practice as well. Have somebody who's actually accountable for that and can lead the service. From a governance point of view, provide great reassurance, and consider a more sophisticated approach to just servicing and maintaining, but also timely replacement. So looking at and contractors in particular have a great part to play in this, of having the right balance between doing servicing, undertaking maintenance, but also replacing plant and equipment at the right time. So quick advert for CHIC, we've got a whole range of building safety and compliance contracts and frameworks and dynamic purchasing system available to help in all of that space. It's going to cost what it will cost. It needs to be done properly, no skimping. And then the final big spend part of what traditionally will be an asset management service is planned maintenance. And this is the sort of £1,200–1,300 per home per annum expenditure, which has been loosely framed under decent homes, but needs to go beyond that. It's about decent homes and places. But I just want to go on to, is investment necessary? Is it right? Are we putting the money into the right things? And this is all about data and asset intelligence. So scary slide. The headlines are: housing landlords have huge chunks of data, most of it held at property level, unique property reference number level. And there's lots of data accessible from the jolly old internet, bringing all of that into one place to understand overall asset performance. So it's the market that your properties are in, it's what the people who live in them and the people who work for the business that manages them think. It's about hard property data and financial information. All needs to come into one place to be able to understand true asset performance. This shows the use of data in a sophisticated way, with tables, with graphs, with maps and so on. And now being able to use data intelligently is absolutely critical. This comes right at the beginning of the asset management planning process, making sure our assets are actually assets. A typical outcome, the graph in the middle, is looking at overall asset performance on the horizontal, an overall asset score, blending market and people and financial and property information, but a financial test on the vertical. and stuff that generally scores well tends to be financially viable, and vice versa. And proportionally, if you look at the top of that graph, you can see a typical outcome for a housing landlord. The majority of stock people like, it's sustainable if you keep investing in it. But the little sort of hill to the left is the stuff that's more questionable. And if you look down the graph, quite a lot of that is probably losing money. And if it's losing money, it's probably because people don't like it, don't like living there, design's poor, areas poor, and so on. You need to look at that in more detail and understand why. So there's the proportions of a typical outcome for any landlord, irrespective of size, based upon sophisticated, intelligent use of data that exists in all landlords. Convert that to a map, then helps you understand what you're going to do about it. So red, amber, and green dots and the map on the left. And you can just about see on the right hand side some blocks of dots with different colors. So if I look at the map on the left, a cluster of red or red and amber performing stock, I'm going to go and do an option appraisal on that stock on an area basis or a neighbourhood basis. If it's a single red dot surrounded by other schemes and properties which are green, it's probably a scheme issue. Could just be a tenancy management issue, could be more significant. So how we use the data to understand overall asset performance, really critical. And on the right hand graph, if you can just about see it, the sort of bottom centre, just left of centre, is a block with on the whole poor performance. These aren't real blocks, they're planted in Birmingham, so but it's a good indication of data. So how we use data to help us understand asset performance before we make investment decisions is really critical. So our £2,300, is that enough? That's the sort of average investment that just deals with what I've talked about: repairs, building safety, and effectively routine planned maintenance, replacing kitchens, bathrooms and heating systems in a timely way. But enter our latest challenge, and I've been really impressed and surprised, I think, because the sector's been quite slow in adapting to strategic asset management challenges for quite some time. Its response to the zero carbon challenge has been huge. We know a lot of the questions, we don't know most of the answers at the moment. We've got to hit EPC-C for 2030. That's achievable for the majority of landlords. But zero carbon for 2050 is a huge target with a huge bill applied to it and lots of stuff that's not achievable. So this graph shows what we've got to do, which is to get existing dwellings up from effectively Ds and Es to Bs and As. There's a big cost associated with that, and lots of challenges that government, Lucy, is going to have to think about. Conservation areas where the planners don't want us to change the windows or the buildings are a poor configuration or whatever, are things we're going to have to deal with in some way, which are now starting to create challenges for some of our colleagues. This graph shows a use of data. On the horizontal is the cost of decarbonisation per property, up to sort of 35,000–40,000, and the level of improvement is on the vertical. And the simple question it raises is, at what point does it stop being cost effective to invest in stock and to actually say, and there's an embodied carbon question around this as well, but to say, is it better to actually do something more radical, more significant with it? So if we take our sort of overall asset performance as it is, and we look at the future energy performance that's possible, and the cost of retrofitting, and an embodied carbon argument, i.e. how much carbon are we using if we're carrying out the work and then and possibly replacing homes, there's going to be a chunk of stock which fails on most of those, and where it does, that's where landlords are going to have to look more comprehensively at regeneration and reinvestment on a different scale to, I think, anything we're envisaging. I've been around asset management a long time. My prediction, I'll probably be retired by the time it's happening, is we probably need to replace 20% of the social housing stock and possibly more in the private housing stock in the country. That sounds dead scary. It's less than 1% replacement a year. but it is, I think, going to fundamentally change asset management strategies and investment plans for landlords going forward. It's big money. We've already need to spend about 350 billion over the next 28-29 years on just maintaining the current decency standard, zero carbon, and this is without neighbourhood work being done, pushes that up by over another 100 billion. So huge spend and huge opportunity for growing SMEs, contractors, skills and training, etc. So a huge challenge for the sector, which I think we're barely starting to really understand. So CHIC's prediction, my prediction, we've got to use data intelligently and get better and better. And we're only just starting to understand the decarbonisation part of that data. So I think 20% plus of the sector's homes really do need either replacing or fundamentally regenerating by 2050 to achieve that target. There's lots of new technology emerging and to come, but if we concentrate on fabric over the 2020s to hit the EPCC target, then we'll let that technology mature, which will help us with the next part of the challenge. Let's not try and crack it all at once. Let's take time to do this thoroughly and properly. Offset is going to be necessary. We're just starting to think at CHIC about how can we collaborate in the sector with our own offset solution. I think breweries are doing this now, so there's no reason that housing organisations can't do it. Because if we can't crack it in the housing stock, can we offset the carbon we are creating? Labour and skills, I've talked about. Social value, outcomes from the investment we need to make is huge. There's a difficult discussion about, we want to bring heating costs down, but do we need to compensate that with some rents going up to actually help us to be able to borrow to make that investment? And I do think, again, that's something, Lucy, I'd welcome the conversation on at some point. And then finally, really importantly, we're struggling as a sector to embrace modern methods of construction for new housing, more regeneration, more new homes, less carbon. MMC, folks, is the way we have to move forward, and we have to not wait for somebody else to do it, but galvanise and build new homes using modern methods of construction, which will also help with the skills gap. And inevitably, I'm going to end by saying, on all of these things, CHIC has or will have solutions. So please come to us for help. And time for action for asset management. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, John. Gosh, lots of challenges in there, and do please use the Q&A button to respond to some of those. I'm sure there'll be many of you watching this webinar who are thinking, gosh, how's that going to work out? So do ask your questions on the Q&A button, as I say. Our final presentation of our trio comes from Senior Art Consultant Rob Collier. Rob, the virtual stage is yours.
Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Right. Okay, this is a sort of quick overview of the situation I found myself in 2017 to do with cladding and the associated building safer issues that have come out and to follow. So, sorry, my screen is not sharing. So there's a quick summary of the content, the cladding situation, associated works, sprinklers, level 4 risk assessments, implications of Hackett, governance and actions, lessons learned, and the current position. So as I say, in 2017, woke up one day to get a lot of questions. What blocks have we got? What they got on them? And instantly people didn't necessarily know. They didn't know if it was going to be the same problem or the same situation. So at the time it was 17 high-rise, 13 of the blocks had varying types of ACM and clay tiles. 3 had Cat 2 ACM, which initially, well, following the BR135 test, we thought was going to be okay, but then on further investigation, the fire barrier configuration meant it couldn't be deemed as comparable with the test. On one block had full clay tiles. Further investigation also found defects in some of the clay tiles on the other blocks, and also the issues with missing fire barriers or poor configuration of fire barriers, or also fire barriers not installed as designed. In addition, there was the associated works. There was the requirement for a waking watch, which was a very expensive element of the work. The requirement for retrofitted alarms. It didn't apply across the country, but in Manchester, Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue refused to support the stay put policy. So we had to go to a stay safe and look at how the evacuation would work around that. Just to compound the headache, we had 3 high-rise blocks with 1960s gas supplies, all individual to properties, lead and copper pipe, which obviously is known to melt should there be a fire. So that was due to be done a couple of years further down the line, but we brought that forward. There was also the consideration of sprinklers, and we moved from the in-house team doing the level 2 fire risk assessments to the high-rise blocks to independent companies doing a level 3 assessment and a level 4 when we got voids back. So looking at the actions around that, particularly to do with the cladding, we were very fortunate, and again, those with local authorities have perhaps struggled in that within probably the space of months, the budget was secured. They started with the resident engagement, and that was ongoing, and that was done via drop-in sessions, website updates, and letter drops. Another key part of this, again, was the appointment of a specialist fire engineer. Building control wouldn't sign anything off. They wanted the fire engineer's approval before building control would sign anything off. We were very fortunate to get a close working relationship with Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue, Manchester Building Control, Homes England, and also MHCLG. So that worked quite well. In Manchester also, they set up the high-rise task force, which was the Great Manchester Combined Authority, and there was shared knowledge. Fire and Rescue, Building Control would attend, so it was all green actions and next steps as a collective to understand where we were going. The difficulty we had was actually understanding what could go back on. There was lots of talk about things like rock panel as a solution. There were implications that hadn't actually undergone through a BR135 test at the time. It then looked in more detail, and it was a different loading to the ACM, so the cladding rails potentially couldn't take it. So it was only till the BR135 test results were released we actually agreed on a very similar system. It was just that it had the fire retardant core. And then following that, we could appoint the contractor 2017. And we started on site in the January of 2018. We had quite a tight program to deliver it within 12 months. Unfortunately, the defects we found within existing fire barriers and fixing details led to delays because there were then disputes between the contractors and the previous contractors. However, we did get quite a lot of the fire barrier work and some cladding work to the clay tiles done as latent defects. Then further down the line came the Homes England grant, and we secured that by the December 2018. And then there was the Homes England audit information, which will come onto in part of the lessons learned. There was a decision made by the board to install the sprinklers. Again, not cheap, £3,000 approximately a property. Not welcomed by everyone because they've all got the picture of Bruce Willis in the head holding a cigarette lighter up to a sprinkler head to trigger it, which it doesn't work, but that's what people thought. So it was trying to get their buy-in. Do we charge leaseholders? One Manchester took the decision not to charge the leaseholders, but there was still a service charge that people, even though it was minimal, people didn't like the idea of it being added. Problems with access, links to existing fire alarm, and again, these were lessons learned as went down the line. If you have a sprinkler system, it's okay. If you have an alarm system, it's okay. But if they're put in as combined, then there have to be certain links and controls between the two systems for them to be deemed compliant. One of the biggest problems we encountered as well was, and back to John's point about knowing your stock and what's in there, is it turned out there was asbestos within the textured coatings on the walls. So we had to have asbestos scrapes before you could actually fix the sprinklers. And then there's the associated increased costs with the elements listed below. Another element of work was the fire risk work. There were some actions we instructed quite quickly after the Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue and the joint inspections, which we needed done quickly. And again, I'll come back that onto lessons learned. But there's stuff around fire doors. Existing fire doors were not certified because they were 1960s blocks, but the fire engineer had to sign them off individually to say he believed they were of a performance and standard that would be comparable, if not better, than a modern day fire door. So there was all sorts of components, and one of the last item put on there was something that came about following an acquisition by the growth and development team, that they purchased a block that had been converted from offices, and so the current day regulations applied, but the 2 lifts that were in the block weren't fire lifts, so there was some quite costly and difficult to coordinate work to retrofit a fire lift in an existing block. I won't go through all the items of this. There's still some sort of uncertainty around what is going to be released from the early adopters. I think we're 2 years on, and what the Joint Combined Authority is going to look like in the regulator. But yeah, so there's still some challenges around this. Again, previously we've had issues around the building safety manager. What does that look like? Is it a technical person? Is it architect? Is it a building surveyor? Is it someone from a health and safety fire background? So there are implications of this. Another implication at the bottom is obviously this now requirement for EWS1 form for people, especially on the right to buy or are selling the properties on. So these were the headline things that came off the back of it. The establishment of a fit-for-purpose health and safety and compliance team, the FRAS training for operatives and surveyors, the appointment of the independent engineer, which carried on beyond the cladding replacement, involved with future schemes, fire assessment of fire doors globally, other wall coatings and finishes on different blocks, testing and checking the paint finishes and coatings within low-rise blocks. The decision to undertake the level 4 fire risk assessments on void properties has uncovered other problems in terms of compartment breaches. One of the ducts that we opened up had an entire section of floor missing. It was just a reinforcement bar. So from the 1960s, the actual slab within the void had never been cast. And the difficult thing with the issues on the level 4, there weren't just common themes. So it wasn't like, oh, well, we've just got a program to go and address fire collars. It was varied in different properties as works had undertaken over the years. So there was, as I said, there was the full review of the stock to try and understand the fabric and the other elements, not just at the building at risk. And establishing a governance team to deliver the actions of the building safety. So in this, it wasn't just sitting with assets. This was a collaboration of assets, growth, repairs, neighbourhoods. So we could look at tackling the plan as a whole. So looking at lessons learned, I think, it was essential to establish the good working relationships, and that worked well. The tenant consultation, and be honest about it, because there were some challenging questions came back. The early engagement of the fire engineer was a benefit. Now, I think the difficulty we had at the time as well, and back to John's point about CHIC, there are now frameworks to access this. At the time, there wasn't, and there was a sudden, demand required for fire engineers, but it wasn't as a publicised profession as, say, your building surveyors, your QSs and that. So it was finding the right people who were available to do it. Some of the people were talking about a 6-month lead time before they could get an engineer on the job. So I think we're in a better position now with the CHIC and the frameworks. There's also getting the procurement right. And this, again, is not just to do with the contractors, it's the consultants. I referenced back to the fire risk company that we got in. We appointed them as a bit of a knee-jerk because that's everything that was being done at the time. With hindsight, and where I had to go to present a paper to the Audit and Risk Committee to a waiver to depart from the finance regs for procurement. The company that we used then were not resourced properly to do the work. It caused us more problems, and we had to unpick some of their recommendations, and they didn't keep proper records. Likewise with the main contractor for the cladding works, that was done quickly to try and get them on board. And with hindsight, I think, if we were using a robust framework that had got all the measures and controls in place, would have mitigated some of the risk. Another lesson learnt was to check the records of the previous contracts. We were also able to mitigate some of the expenditure risk because of latent defects, and the 12-year period hadn't expired on the old contracts. And this linked to the Homes England grant was the maintaining of quality records, because we acted so quickly, we were ahead of the game. But unfortunately, when Homes England were then wanting information to support the grant application, it wasn't something we'd considered, and we had to go back and retrospectively try and find records, or there were certain things that we just didn't have the information for. Because an example of this was, the decisions made to not take legal action against the original contractors. Well, it was a board decision at the time, and luckily I managed to find one board paper with a note that actually documented the support that had been taken from a solicitors and the insurers with regards to the success of a legal claim succeeding. So it was, luckily I was able to find that to demonstrate it was, but the records, as I say, if we'd known we were having to go for the grant from the outset, I think we'd have maintained better records. But fortunately we were able to do it, and we were successful with the grant. My opinion on the current sector position: I think housing associations are more advanced than the private sector. I know there's problems within the private sector because it's tied up in the detail of who actually owns the block, who manages the block, records of what was installed at the time. Certain local authorities aren't in the position to have had the funding available the housing associations can levy, so there's a risk there. I think there's limited and varied uptake on the building safer recommendations. Some companies ahead of the game, some people are waiting for the release of the early adopters information. What's the new joint combined authority and regulator going to look at, and how involved are they going to be in checking the gateways? What sanctions will be imposed? And the difficulty, particularly as I found with the 1960s type blocks, is the uncertainty with the existing stock and the sort of components and structures that you may uncover. Okay, so thank you, and back to Mark.
Muted again, Mark.
Yep, there we are. I'm back. 3 excellent presentations. Thank you all very much indeed. There are some questions coming through on the Q&A. Please do use that for anything that you want to ask our panelists, or indeed to comment on. I mean, what really struck me listening to all 3 of those presentations is, and Lucy mentioned Grenfell right at the top of her presentation, is that that appalling tragedy clearly has sort of initiated a really deep look at the quality of our housing, and not just that, the sort of physical, the technical, the social failures of the housing sector. And every time we look, just listening to Rob, then you look and you find things that are really not right. So I wanted to just, before we come on to the questions on the Q&A, just Lucy, if I could ask you, I mean, there's so much going on. And in some ways, it's almost a bit overwhelming, I suspect, for people, because they're having to think about so many things at the same time. What would you say was the sort of priority for asset managers right now, thinking about where they're going to put their immediate effort in order to ensure that, one, they don't fall foul of the legislation, but also to do the right thing?
I'd say there's 2 key areas. The first, obviously, is building safety. So government has set out its expectations in respect to building safety. The sector should be preparing itself for when it will be required to present safety cases to the new regulator when that comes into effect. So the sector should be giving some attention to that. And the second area, of course, is climate change and net zero. Government is committed to net zero by 2050. That will require a radical change in the way that homes are both insulated and heated. So the sector should be thinking forward to that, and I can see there's some questions there in the chat about that.
Well, let's just quickly jump into those, if I may. You've probably seen the one Nick Sedgwick has asked. You mentioned that the government is currently drafting the social housing regulation bill. This is obviously in addition to the social housing Act that was published this year, 2021. Given that I don't think there was any reference to this in the Queen's speech, as Nick says, can you offer any guidance on potential timescales? And broadly, what do you think that additional legislation is likely to mean in terms of asset management?
Yeah, so I mean, many parts of the sector were disappointed that the regulation bill didn't make the Queen's speech this time. The truth is there is limited parliamentary time. Government and officials are absolutely committed to taking forward this bill, and we will continue to strive to do that as soon as that becomes possible. But I think the main point is that we're not waiting for legislation to try and engender the culture change that's required. I mean, in my presentation, I spoke about some of the work that's already underway in respect of the Decent Home Standard Review, electrical safety, smoke and carbon monoxide alarms. We also issued a national campaign on complaints awareness to let residents know how they can seek redress from their landlords. There's also a clause in the Building Safety Bill about speeding up access to redress through the Housing Ombudsman. And we spoke about the appointment of the new head of the consumer arm of the Regulator of Social Housing, who's starting this summer, and that will be prior to the legislation going through that will really set her functions. So in terms of asset managers, I mean, what the regulation bill aims to do is to move the regulatory regime from what has been a very reactive system up until now on consumer issues to become a more proactive regulatory regime. So where to date the regulator has been just responding to complaints, and would be looking for evidence of really serious detriment and systemic changes, systemic failures rather. Now the regulator will be undertaking inspections, some of the larger landlords. It will be proactively collecting data on a range of key performance indicators, tenant service measures that cover a range of asset management considerations like compliance with decent homes, for example, and really actively seeking evidence that homes are being well maintained and being willing to take action where that isn't happening.
Is there going to be a consultation, or is that underway?
The call for evidence was published alongside the Green Paper on social housing regulation. So no, there won't be a further consultation on that. So yeah, I would recommend any asset manager with an interest in this to follow the progress through Parliament.
Yeah, all right, thank you. There's another question for you, which I'll come to in a moment, because I wanted to bring John in on a question from Rosemary Coyne, who says that the current local authority delivery funding, which is set at 5,000 for social housing, 10,000 for private, does not seem sufficient to promote a fabric first approach. And Rosemary suggests that this contradicts your recommendation of a fabric first approach. John, what's your feeling about that?
I think key question, Rosemary, thank you. All the data we're seeing seems to bottom out that the decarbonisation investment cost for most social housing homes, and probably therefore the private sector as well, is closer to 20,000 a property, possibly slightly over 20 to 24,000. That's where we seem to be. How and when that's spent is now a sort of 28, 29 year journey. So if we were going to be replacing single glazed windows with double glazed in 2035, we might now be looking at triple glazing. So there's an extra overcost. But if we get the fabric sorted, which is what the question is about, then that is there to stay. It uses the property uses less energy. The technological advancements are moving apace, and just the disappearance of gas in due course and replacement with whatever is going to be an absolutely huge revolution. And I just think back to a phase in the 1990s where we put complicated heat recovery systems into properties. They were the thing of the future. Open the airing cupboard and you were greeted by NASA, and the average householder could not control those systems or understand them, and surprise, surprise, open the window, and they've all been taken out. So I have a real caution about how much technology can help us solve the problem as well as overcomplicate. But in simple terms, the spend is going to add that 104 billion to the social housing sector, and probably more than that to the private sector. We've got to find a way of funding it, it's our sector challenge for the next decade, effectively.
Yeah, you mentioned a figure of 2.3 thousand per house being the sort of current sort of spend, and then you listed a whole series of things that are going to push that up. Do you have a figure in your head for where we're going to be, let us say, in 5 years' time, as the sort of kind of spend that landlords are going to need to be looking at?
Yeah, I mean, 20 to 25,000 pounds per home per annum on average over 30 years is going to stick £600 or £700 onto that bill. So we're looking at a figure realistically that business plans need to find of nearer £3,000 per home per annum over the next 3 decades on average, to be able to meet maintain the current decent home standards, achieve a decent home plus standard by investing in communal areas, external areas and so on, and to address the decarbonisation challenge. So that's the sort of number. We're going to be looking at 50% of rental income in many cases, but we're going to need to be able to borrow to be able to fund some of that. Hence the need to look at what's the cost saving on heating and how much can we legitimately recycle through income to raise funding to pay for this.
Indeed. Huge questions. Rob, anonymous attendee is asking, what will be the minimum existing standard of competency / training that will be expected for the new building safety manager roles? I mean, do you have a thought on that?
I think there's already a standard training package you can do, but it's not mandatory. And I think this is one of the difficulties we experienced is, one of the anecdotes that I heard was that one of the blocks that had dedicated caretakers per tower block suddenly rebadged them as building safety managers per block, which isn't really appropriate. I think I was previously involved with the recruitment of 2 building safety managers. One came very much from a health and safety background. One had come from a tenancy background who'd then got into compliance, and they were quite a good amalgam, because then you'd got someone who'd been very much involved with the tenant engagement. So I think it's also going to be, I'm not answering your question as such here, but I think part of the issue as well is what buildings are you going to be dealing with, and there's almost going to be 2 strands to it, in my opinion, because there's the building safety manager for the existing stock, and then there's the building safety manager that is then involved with the new build and more focus on the gateways for sort of access and occupation.
We'll be interested to see where the legislation comes in and demands certain standards on that. There's a question from Maggie Pania. Lucy, she refers to the fact that you mentioned decent homes 2 hadn't been agreed, but what focus is the department putting on decency of place and environment as a potential component of that?
Thanks, Mark. So I think COVID-19 really showed us the importance of having well-maintained communal areas for leisure and recreation. In the social housing white paper, we committed to consider how improvements sort of around estates could be incorporated into the decent home standard. so that places become kind of more livable, safe and comfortable. I mean, I think how residents feel about their place is incredibly important, and poorly maintained areas can contribute towards the stigmatisation of social housing, which is something government really wants to overcome. So I would say it's an active consideration as a strand of thinking in the Decent Homes Review. We will be constrained a little, I think, by the art of the possible in this regard. You know, definitions of beauty and appearance are subjective, but we'll do our best, I think, to try and bring this into the standard where we can.
Yeah, because as you were saying, I mean, lockdown really has made people focus much more on their neighbourhood and the location, on decent green space and so on. So be interesting to see how that develops. There's clearly a great deal to be thinking about for everyone in the sector right now. We've sadly run out of time on this session, so a huge thank you to Lucy, to John, and to Rob for all their wisdom. Thank you to you for your questions, and there are a couple still outstanding, and I know that the panelists will endeavour to try and answer those for you. Don't forget that a video of this session, and indeed the presentations, will be available to download from the CHIC website. And of course, there's another top webinar, this time on post-Brexit procurement. That's in half an hour. If you want to come and you haven't registered, again, just go to the CHIC website. But until then, thank you and goodbye.